That Friday night was the most intense and unforgettable night of my life. The house was so quiet and peaceful that I felt an unusual calm, exhausted from a long week and desperate for sleep. As I lay down, I believed nothing could disrupt the stillness of the night. I had been a single mother for 8 years since my divorce, and although my ex-husband and I didn't have a bad relationship, we had simply grown apart. Raising my son, David, alone was both the most rewarding and challenging thing I had ever done. He was everything to me, smart, funny, and kind, but being both his mother and father wasn't easy. And that night I was so tired that I barely managed to put on my pajamas before collapsing into bed. The house was silent, and David had gone to bed hours earlier after finishing his homework and playing video games, giving me a rare moment to myself. In my room, the moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls as I snuggled under the blanket, savoring the warmth and letting my mind drift. Life had been peaceful recently, which was a welcome change after a tough year. David and I had endured so much together since his father left, but we had built a good life. Even though David was nearly 20 now, we remained very close, and his caring, thoughtful nature always touched me, though I sometimes worried he carried too much responsibility for someone his age. I smiled at the thought of him, feeling so lucky to have such a kind and loving son, but that night, exhaustion quickly overcame me, and I drifted into sleep, feeling heavy and drowsy. Suddenly, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the knock came again, gentle yet distinct, fully waking me. "Mom?" David's voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the fog of sleep as I blinked, trying to focus on the door, where his silhouette stood in the dim light from the hallway. I glanced around, and then, even more specifically, looked across the hallway. I sat up, trying to fully wake myself. "David, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep. He hesitated before stepping into the room, quietly closing the door behind him, looking uncertain about coming in. I couldn't sleep," he said softly, his eyes cast down as he stood near my bed. Instantly, worry crept in. I could sense something was troubling him. Since the divorce, David occasionally had trouble sleeping, but he rarely talked about it. I knew his father leaving had affected him more deeply than he let on, and tonight, the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Come here," I said gently, patting the empty space beside me. "You can stay with me tonight if you want." He hesitated for a moment, then came over and lay down beside me, turning on his side to face me. In the dim light, I could see how tired he looked, but there was also a vulnerability in him that I wasn't used to seeing. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked softly. David shook his head, his dark hair falling over his eyes. "No, I just wanted to be close to you." My heart warmed at his words. It had been so long since David had sought comfort from me like this, like when he was a child. I brushed his hair away from his forehead and smiled at him. "That's okay," I whispered, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You can stay as long as you need." He returned my smile, but I could tell something was still weighing on him, something he wasn't ready to share. I didn't press him. Instead, I lay back down, pulled the blanket over us both, and let the stillness of the room wrap around us. For a while, we lay there quietly, the calmness soothing us both. David's breathing slowed, and I thought he had fallen asleep. Then, so softly I almost missed it, he spoke. "Mom, do you ever miss him?" His question startled me, but I knew he was asking about his father. It was a question I had avoided for years, one I didn't know how to answer. "I do, sometimes," I admitted quietly. "But things weren't good between us, David. You know that." He nodded, but I could see he wasn't satisfied. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he pressed. I sighed, the weight of old regret surfacing. "Maybe," I said honestly. But we can't change what happened. We have to move forward." David looked down, fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. I guess I just wonder if maybe I could have done something different, you know? Like if I had been better. His words pierced my heart, and I immediately sat up to face him. David, no, I said firmly. This wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. He avoided my gaze, his voice barely audible. Sometimes it feels like, if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left. Tears filled my eyes as I pulled him into a hug. He stiffened for a moment, but then melted into my arms, burying his face in my shoulder. David, listen to me, I said, my voice trembling. Your dad made his own choices. It had nothing to do with you. It was his decision, and it was never your responsibility. You've always been more than enough for me, David. My voice was filled with love and reassurance as I whispered, "You're everything to me." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could still feel the tension in him, the unspoken weight of years of guilt and pain. We held each other close, the silence between us soothing and comforting. Slowly, his body began to relax, his breathing evening out as he drifted off to sleep in my arms. Yet as I sat there, cradling him, my mind refused to rest. Memories and emotions churned, a whirlwind of everything we had endured together. And amidst that quiet moment, a feeling stirred within me. Something unfamiliar, something I couldn't quite name. It was a warmth that radiated through my chest, a connection that felt deeper and more profound than the typical bond between a mother and her son. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the steady rhythm of his breathing, but the sensation lingered, a quiet whisper that refused to be ignored. Morning came too quickly, the soft light of dawn casting gentle hues across the room, washing away the shadows of the night, but leaving me with a heart full of unanswered questions. David slept soundly beside me, his face peaceful and relaxed, the tension of the previous night seemingly forgotten. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with love and pride, yet beneath that love lingered an unfamiliar feeling. A subtle undercurrent I couldn't quite define. Carefully, I slipped out of bed, making sure not to wake him, and went downstairs to prepare breakfast. The comforting rhythm of cooking brought a sense of normalcy, but my mind kept drifting back to our late-night conversation. David had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized just how much guilt he had internalized over his father's absence. The weight he carried pained me deeply, a burden I wished I could lift from him. But it wasn't just his words that stayed with me. It was the way he had looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes, the unspoken yearning for something more. And, if I was honest, the warmth I'd felt while holding him had stirred something within me that I couldn't ignore. It was a connection that seemed to go beyond the natural boundaries of our roles, a whisper of something I wasn't ready to confront. I tried to brush it aside, reminding myself that he was my son, but the feeling persisted, stubborn and unresolved before dinner was over. Before dinner was over, David came downstairs, his hair tousled and his lanky frame still clinging to the remnants of adolescence. Yet, there was a quiet maturity in his eyes, a glimpse of the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a bright smile, determined to mask the complicated emotions lingering from the night before. Morning, sleepyhead, I said cheerfully, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. Morning, he mumbled, settling into his chair and diving into his breakfast. We ate in a comfortable silence, the golden morning light spilling through the kitchen window and casting a warm glow around us. Occasionally, I felt his gaze on me, but I'd decided not to bring up the conversation from the previous night. He seemed calmer, more like himself, and I didn't want to disrupt the fragile sense of peace we'd found. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. Thanks for last night, Mom. I needed that. His words, laced with vulnerability, caught me off guard. You never have to thank me, David, I replied warmly. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me, as if he were searching for something unspoken. The moment stretched between us, and I felt the subtle shift in our relationship. A new depth in his eyes, a yearning for something beyond the usual dynamic of mother and son. And to my surprise, a part of me, one I had kept hidden, felt it too. After breakfast, David lingered at the counter, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on its surface. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. I sighed, the familiar ache of past regrets stirring within me. "Maybe," I answered gently, "but we can't change what happened. All we can do is move forward." He nodded but didn't look up, his attention fixed on his restless hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done something, been better, you know?" His voice was barely audible, heavy with guilt and self-blame. His words hit me deeply, and I couldn't hold back. I stepped closer and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, then drew him into a tender embrace. He hesitated for a moment before leaning into me, his body relaxing as if the weight he carried had lessened, even if just a little. "David, you didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault," I said, my voice heavy with emotion. He turned his gaze away, speaking so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Sometimes it feels like if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." Tears welled in my eyes as I pulled him closer, holding him tightly. He hesitated briefly, then surrendered, his face pressing into my shoulder as he let out a shaky breath. "David, listen to me," I said firmly but gently. "Your father's choices were his own. You have always been more than enough. His leaving had nothing to do with you." He nodded slowly, his body softening against mine as the tension in his shoulders began to melt away. As we stayed in the embrace, I felt that unfamiliar warmth rising again, a mixture of relief, affection, and a deeper connection I couldn't fully articulate. The bond between us, so long defined by the simple roles of mother and son, seemed to shift subtly, evolving into something I didn't entirely understand, but couldn't ignore. For now, I held him, letting the moment stretch without probing, without overthinking. It felt as though we had crossed an invisible threshold, and while I couldn't predict what lay ahead, I knew something fundamental had changed. In the quiet, as I cradled him and the darkness wrapped around us like a cocoon, a realization settled over me. The delicate balance of our relationship was shifting. Its foundations being reshaped into something new and uncharted. End quote. And the foundations being reshaped into something new and uncharted, a ripple of uncertainty passed through me. A quiet, trembling recognition that we were on the brink of something unknown. Yet, within that uncertainty was an undeniable sense of anticipation, an acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. The path before us was uncertain, but it was one we would navigate together, no matter where it led. Dawn arrived gently, sunlight threading its way through the curtains, urging me awake. Beside me, David slept soundly, his face peaceful, free of the turmoil that had weighed on him the night before. I watched him quietly, my heart swelling with a familiar maternal love, but beneath that love, a different feeling simmered, subtle, persistent, and unsettling. It was the same unfamiliar warmth I had felt last night, a sensation that seemed both comforting and confusing. Carefully slipping out of bed so as not to disturb him, I headed downstairs and began preparing breakfast. The routine providing a semblance of normalcy. Yet, as I flipped pancakes, my thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet vulnerability David had shown. I hadn't fully grasped how deeply he'd internalized the guilt of his father's absence, or how much pain he had carried silently for so long. That realization ached within me, a longing to ease his burden. But there was something more, a subtle shift in the way he had sought comfort in my embrace, in the closeness he craved, that seemed to transcend the roles of mother and son. And if I was honest with myself, I had felt it too. The warmth that had filled me while holding him was more than maternal instinct. It was a connection that both unsettled and intrigued me, a whisper at the edges of my thoughts that I couldn't fully ignore. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the steady rhythm of cooking. "He's your son," I reminded myself firmly. "Just a boy." But the sensation lingered, a quiet undercurrent that refused to fade. Eventually, David emerged, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his hair tousled and his expression soft. Morning, he murmured, his voice still tinged with the remnants of sleep. His tousled hair framed a face still holding the innocence of youth, yet his eyes revealed a newfound maturity, a glimpse of the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, masking the emotions that lingered from the night before. Morning, sleepyhead, I said cheerfully, placing a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. Morning, he mumbled, settling into his chair and diving into his breakfast with eager appetite. We ate in comfortable silence, the morning light casting a soft glow over the kitchen. Occasionally, I felt his gaze on me, but I chose to say nothing, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace we seemed to have found. He looked more like himself, at ease, and I didn't want to disrupt that delicate balance. Eventually, he broke the silence, his voice filled with sincerity. Thanks for last night, Mom. I needed that. His vulnerability caught me off guard, and I smiled gently. You never have to thank me, David, I replied warmly. Yet, despite the ordinary rhythm of our routines, the atmosphere between us felt different. It was subtle, almost intangible, a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection we had shared the night before. The change wasn't something I could fully name, but I felt it in the spaces between us, in the silence that now held weight and meaning. As evening settled in, my thoughts drifted back to David, his transformation from boy to young man, and the intimacy we had shared the night before. The more I reflected, the more I realized that my feelings for him had shifted, evolving beyond the boundaries of a mother's love. After dinner, we curled up on the couch to watch a movie. The room was dimly lit, the flickering images on the screen casting shadows across the walls. We sat mostly in silence, comfortable in each other's presence. But as the movie wore on, I became acutely aware of his proximity. Each subtle movement brought his arm brushing against mine, and my heart quickened in response. I tried to focus on the film, but the tension between us seemed palpable. A silent orchestra of unspoken emotions. Midway through the movie, David shifted closer, his arm pressing against mine. But this time, he didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a jolt of awareness through me. I glanced at him and our eyes met. His gaze was intense, filled with the emotions I'd been trying to suppress all day. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. Our fingers intertwined and he squeezed my hand gently, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. The simple touch sent a flutter through my chest, a strange blend of familiarity and something exhilaratingly new. We sat like that for what felt like a long while, hands clasped together in the dim light, silently acknowledging the shift in the dynamics of our relationship. It was a turning point, an unspoken understanding that transcended the limits of our familial roles. I didn't know what the future held, but I felt the change. David was no longer just my son, he was something more. Someone I cared for in a way that couldn't be defined. The movie ended, yet we stayed on the couch, the credits rolling unnoticed. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his chest with each breath. The act was simple, but in that moment it felt deeply intimate. A quiet acknowledgement of the growing connection between us. Mom? David whispered, his voice soft and uncertain. Yeah? I'm really glad you're here, he said, and his words, simple yet profound, echoed the feelings I held in my own heart. I was glad he was here too, glad for the closeness we'd found, this unexpected intimacy that both terrified and exhilarated me. As I lay there in the darkness, wrapped in the warmth of his embrace, a deep realization swept over me. Our relationship was changing, the delicate balance we'd once shared now teetering on the edge of something new, something unknown. A slight tremor of apprehension coursed through me. What might this transformation mean for us? Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was also an undeniable sense of anticipation, a quiet understanding that this was only the beginning of a journey we hadn't yet begun to comprehend. Dawn arrived with quiet insistence, the soft light seeping through the curtains, waking me from my slumber. Beside me, David slept peacefully, his face serene, untouched by the burdens of the night before. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with the same maternal love I'd always known. Yet beneath it, there was something else, a feeling I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Yet beneath the familiar affection, something else stirred, a sensation I couldn't quite define. It was the same strange feeling that had brushed against my awareness the night before. It intrigued and unsettled me in equal measure. Quietly, I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb his peaceful slumber, and made my way downstairs to begin preparing breakfast. As I stood at the stove flipping pancakes with the ease of routine, my thoughts drifted back to our late-night conversation. David had always been sensitive, but I hadn't truly understood the depth of his internal struggles, the weight of his father's absence, and the guilt he had silently carried for so long. Now it weighed heavily on my heart. But there was more to it than that. I couldn't ignore the change in him. The way he had sought comfort in my arms, a yearning for a closeness that reached beyond the typical boundaries of mother and son. And if I was honest, I had felt it too. A warmth, a comfort that went beyond maternal instinct when I held him. I tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. He's just a boy, I reminded myself. Your son. But the feeling lingered, an unrelenting whisper that refused to be silenced. Soon David emerged from his slumber, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His hair was tousled, giving him an air of youthful innocence. Yet there was a new maturity in his gaze, a hint of the man he was becoming. So I greeted him with a warm smile, doing my best to mask the emotions the morning had stirred within me. "Sleepyhead," I chirped, placing a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. "Morning," he mumbled, settling into his chair and eagerly digging into his breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence, the morning sunlight casting a warm glow over the kitchen. I could feel his eyes on me occasionally, but I chose to remain silent, not yet ready to confront the complexities of the previous night's conversation. He seemed more at ease, more like himself, and I didn't want to disrupt the fragile peace we had found. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice tinged with gratitude. "Thanks for last night, Mom. I needed that." His vulnerability caught me off guard. "You never have to thank me, David," I reassured him. "I'll always be here for you no matter what." He nodded, but his gaze lingered, a silent question in his eyes, a mirror to the unspoken emotions I had been grappling with. There was a depth and intensity to his gaze that went beyond the familiar comfort of our mother-son bond. The day unfolded without incident. David retreated to his room, immersed in homework and video games, while I occupied myself with household tasks. Yet something had subtly shifted between us. A quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of the deeper connection that had emerged. As evening fell, my thoughts returned to David, to his transformation from boy to young man, and to the closeness we had shared the night before. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings for him had evolved, transcending the boundaries of maternal love. That evening, after dinner, we settled on the couch to watch a movie. The room was dimly lit, the flickering images on the screen casting dancing shadows across the walls. We were mostly silent, content in each other's presence. But as the movie progressed, I became acutely aware of his proximity, the way his arm brushed against mine with each subtle shift. My heart quickened, and I tried to focus on the film, but the tension between us was palpable, a silent symphony of unspoken emotions. Halfway through the movie, David shifted closer. His arm pressed against mine. This time, he didn't move away. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a shiver of awareness through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met. His gaze held a newfound intensity, a reflection of the emotions I had been trying to suppress all day. Without conscious thought, I reached out and took his hand, our fingers intertwining. He didn't resist, instead squeezing my hand gently. His thumb traced a slow circle on my skin. The simple gesture sent a flutter through my heart, a sensation both familiar and exhilaratingly new. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped in the dim light, a silent testament to the shifting dynamics of our relationship. It was a turning point, a moment of unspoken understanding that transcended the boundaries of our familial roles. I didn't know what the future held, but the warmth of his hand in mine left an indelible mark on my heart, one that whispered of change, of something deeper and uncharted. And that was, however, I was aware that things were shifting. Furthermore, David was more than just my son. He was more than that. He was someone I loved in a way that was impossible to describe. We stayed on the couch while the credits rolled without seeing the end of the film. My head rested on his shoulder. He could feel his chest rising and falling steadily with each breath. Even though it was a modest gesture, it felt incredibly personal, like a subtle recognition of the bond that was developing between us. David said in a scarcely discernible murmur, "Mom?" "Yes. I'm so happy you're here." The sentiment in my own heart was echoed by his straightforward yet deep words. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I felt fully alive, and I was happy that he was here as well. I was happy for this unexpected intimacy, which was both frightening and thrilling. There was only the unadulterated, unquestionable truth of our love. No confusion, no guilt. It was a relationship rooted in trust, understanding, and years of shared experiences that went beyond blood. It was a love that seemed as inevitable as the dawn and as natural as breathing. After our shared passion, we lay there in silence, broken only by the gentle cadence of our breathing. At last, David retreated. His loving gaze melted my heart as it searched mine. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice a gentle caress in the darkness. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My heart was filled with emotions that defied language. "Yes," I murmured in a voice laden with unspoken truths. "We're okay." Later that night, after the remnants of dinner had been cleaned away and the home had settled into a calm silence, David and I found ourselves on the back porch, wrapped in the tranquility of the night. The air was fresh and chilly. The stars sparkled like jewels over the vast canvas of the sky. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief, a release from the weight that had been pushing down on me. We did not say much, yet words were unnecessary. Simply being with him, experiencing the peaceful beauty of the night, was plenty. There was no haste or pressure, a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Whatever it was between us, it was unfolding naturally, and I was content to let it bloom at its own pace. He grabbed for my hand, sending a warm sensation through me like wildfire. I smiled, gently squeezing his hand, and we sat there, fingers intertwined, basking in the warm glory of the stars. It was a love that defied categorization, a bond that extended beyond the confines of our familial obligations. And in that moment, under the huge expanse of the night sky, I knew we'd tackle whatever problems awaited us together. The execution proceeded at sunset. As the days turned into weeks, our connection grew deeper, woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. We didn't require a title to define it, simply was. It was in the way our eyes met, in the lingering touches, in the quiet moments we shared, that we created a world that was uniquely ours. With each passing day, our bond grew deeper and more tangible. The struggle I had felt before had vanished, replaced with a sense of rightness, a sensation that here was where I was supposed to be. David was no longer simply my son, he was my partner, confidant, and lover. Our connection had grown into something lovely, meeting a need we hadn't even realized we had. It wasn't until a rainy afternoon in late October that I realized the depth of our love. The sky was a canvas of stormy grays, and the rain fell steadily against the windows. David and I were curled up on the couch in the living room, with a fire crackling in the hearth, casting a pleasant warmth over the room. We were enveloped in a blanket, the warmth of the fire and the intimacy of our proximity providing a respite from the storm outside. David was leaning on me, his head resting on my shoulder, and I absent-mindedly stroked my fingers through his hair, enjoying the peaceful intimacy of the moment. The rain-streaked windows obscured the outside world, providing a sensation of seclusion and being in our own small realm. I could feel his breathing slow and steady, and I knew without saying anything that he was experiencing the same shift in our relationship, the same undeniable draw towards something more substantial. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine, and the sincerity of our love echoed between us. "Excuse me," the ghost whispered as I moved towards him, like he couldn't tear his eyes away from my face to watch me walk. It wasn't simply love. It was a bond that went beyond the typical roles we'd played, a connection that had grown into something deeper, unmistakable. "Mom," he said, his voice full of anguish. I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue, knowing that whatever he said next would change everything. "I adore you," he said, his hand is stretching out to seize mine. "Not only because you are my mother, but because of who you are and everything about you. And I'm not sure if that's acceptable or not, but I can't stop it." His words swept over me like a warm wave, filling the room with love that caused my heart to throb in the most lovely way. I had sensed his feelings, but seeing him express them and acknowledge the intensity of his emotions made it all the more genuine. I clasped his palm, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath my fingertips. "David," I whispered, my voice quivering slightly, "I love you, and I always have. But this time is different." He nodded. His eyes searched mine for comfort, for an answer to the unspoken query that lingered between us. "I'm not sure what this signifies," I continued, but I knew I felt the same way, and it didn't feel wrong to me. It felt natural. A warm smile appeared on his lips, and my heart soared with a joy I had never experienced before. "I'm delighted you feel that way," he muttered, "because I'm not sure what I would do if you didn't." I reached out and caressed his cheek. I felt the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. "We'll work it out," I told him, "together." We sat quietly for a minute, our gazes locked. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the crackle of the fire. Words were superfluous. We'd already said everything we needed to say. We both understood how we felt, and we knew it was true and unmistakable. David slowly leaned in. His eyes never left mine, and he kissed me gently, reluctantly. It was a sweet, sensitive kiss, full of all the love and longing we'd been keeping hidden for so long. There was no rush, simply a genuine expression of our strong connection. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with emotion, and I realized we'd reached a point of no return. Instead of panic, I felt a sense of calm and conviction that here was where we were supposed to be. He drew me in, his arms closing around me, and we held each other as the rain continued to fall, the fire throwing a warm glow over our embrace. In that moment, I knew we'd face whatever problems were ahead together. The rest of the evening was a whirlwind of soft touches, whispered discussions, and tender kisses. We did not talk about the future or the ramifications of our newfound love. All that mattered was the current moment and the mutual intimacy it provided. As the rain resumed its soft lullaby, I was struck by how rapidly our friendship had evolved. David had matured from a boy to a man, and as a result, our relationship had evolved into something unexpected, beautiful, and ideally suited to us. That night, David returned to my room without hesitation. He slid into bed next to me and wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. It wasn't the warm embrace of a mother and son. It was an embrace between lovers. Quills, two spirits connected. I placed my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a melody of love and contentment. I felt at ease for the first time in years. I had no idea I was missing this sense of completion. Whatever this was or had become, I was prepared for it. David and I had always been close, but now there was something more. Something that eluded description. We were partners, lovers, two spirits united by a love that surpassed convention. I smiled as I fell asleep. It was ridiculous, I knew, but it felt fantastic.